think.
Wait for the day. Okay, there it goes. Great. Thanks so much. Welcome, everybody. My name is Teresa. As Malia said, I'm one of the asset managers here at the state of Colorado. So today we're going to be talking about accessibility requirements as it relates to federally funded projects. Federal projects funded with federal funds through DOH. If you do have a project with state funds that you have any questions about, we do recommend you reach out to your asset manager directly. So, there we go. So we're going to be covering, this is what we're going to be covering today. First, we're going to go just a really brief overview of applicable laws that cover accessibility, a brief overview of our policies and procedures, and then we're going to take a look at some resources that we have available for you and some requirements of federally funded housing developments going forward. So one of the reasons we're having this training right now is that in July of 2024, DOH did sign a voluntary compliance agreement with HUD's Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. And so as a result of that, we took a look at our own policies and procedures, and we did a little revamp, a little house cleaning. And we also have some additional requirements for physical accessibility for projects in the future. And we have some additional requirements that we'll be monitoring for all of our federally funded projects that are in the period of affordability and going forward in the future as it relates to programmatic accessibility, effective communication, reasonable accommodation, stuff like that. So just really briefly, Section 504, ADA, and the Fair Housing Act are basically the laws that apply to accessibility as it relates to federally funded fair housing, affordable housing. So Section 504, as you all probably already know, prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability. It applies to federally funded projects only, and it has requirements related to programmatic accessibility, reasonable accommodation, effective communication, and physical accessibility. So a couple different things that it addresses. Like I said, we have additional training on Section 504 and the other laws, so I'm not going to go really into depth on these. American with Disabilities Act addresses physical accessibility requirements primarily for public facilities. And so as it relates to housing developments, that would include your parking lot, your common use areas, stuff like that. The units themselves typically aren't covered by ADA, but it does apply to your common areas. And finally, the Fair Housing Act. This, of course, applies across the board to projects that are both publicly funded and privately owned. It's got physical accessibility requirements for developments of 4 or more units, and it also has just wide-reaching requirements prohibiting discrimination on a variety of housing-related activities. So if you as a private citizen go to get a mortgage or rent a home or anything like that, it prohibits discrimination. I'll hand it off to Jennifer to talk about some of the revamped DOH policies that we've got in place.
Awesome. Thank you, Teresa. Everyone's favorite policies, so hang in there with me. We're going to start with reasonable accommodation policy, but just as a reminder, reasonable accommodation is a change, exception, or adjustment to a rule, policy, practice, or service that may be necessary for a person with disabilities to have an equal opportunity to use and enjoy a dwelling unit, including public and common spaces like Teresa mentioned. With this policy, a reasonable accommodation may be requested verbally or in writing by an applicant, a beneficiary, or a resident. When a request is made, the 504 coordinator or that reasonable and responsible individual must have an interactive conversation with the requester to ensure all understanding of all the details within that request. Next slide, please. Continuing on, so that 504 coordinator, the responsible individual, needs to notate the following information when they receive a reasonable accommodation request. The date that request was made, either if that was in writing or it was made verbally, the person requesting that accommodation, the nature of the request, the verification of disability that's on file, or a verification of disability that's verified via a knowledgeable professional. And then, of course, we need a nexus between that disability and the accommodation that that individual is seeking out. Lastly, it is the policy of DOH and the Office of Housing Finance and Sustainability to seek out only the minimum information needed to determine if the accommodation sought would serve an individual's disability-related needs. With the reasonable accommodation procedure, that 504 coordinator has 10 business days to respond in writing with that final determination, and they should follow the process clarified in the reasonable accommodation policy. Should that reasonable accommodation request be denied, that requester is allowed to appeal that decision and file a grievance, and we'll get to that in a few slides. Next, we are requiring a reasonable accommodation log, and it's exactly what you think it is. It's a log of the reasonable accommodations that have been submitted. And so in this log, we are looking to see the name of the requester, their current address and their phone number, a description of their request they're making, the date of that request, status, whether that was approved or denied in whole or part, the date of the approval or the denial. If it was denied, making reference to the reason for that denial. If it was approved, the anticipated implementation date for fulfillment of that request, the date that accommodation was provided. And then lastly, pending and final appeals or grievances of denied or delayed reasonable accommodation requests, including the details such as the date and time of the appeal, the final decision and outcome, and then the implementation if that request was granted. Now, Teresa referenced the regulations that we follow with the effective communication policy, but it's DOH's policy to provide interested persons, including persons with hearing, vision, speech, manual, or other communication-related disabilities, information concerning the existence of the location of these accessible services, activities, and facilities. It is our policy to not ask or require individuals to provide and/or pay for their own interpreters or other auxiliary aids. And it is our policy to furnish appropriate auxiliary aids where necessary to afford an individual with a disability an opportunity to participate in, benefit from DOH's multifamily housing programs, services, and activities. Finally, the policy for DOH, we provide for individuals who are blind, have low vision, or have cognitive disabilities to receive forms, notices, and other information in alternative formats as they request. We also will provide information for individuals with the TDD or the TYY phone number or the Colorado Relay phone number, which you can find in this slide. For the grievance procedure policy, the 504 regulation prohibits discrimination in programs and activities that receive federal financial assistance from HUD, which also includes housing. Housing providers cannot discriminate against people with disabilities in a number of ways, denying or refusing to sell or rent to a person with a disability, imposing different application or criteria, rental fees or sales prices, requiring people with disabilities to live in certain areas of a housing community, refusing to make certain repairs, limiting access to recreational or community spaces, or denying people with disabilities the opportunity to serve on planning or advisory boards. Continuing on, grievances must be submitted to the 504 coordinator within 60 days of the date the person filing that grievance became aware of the alleged discriminatory action. The complaint must be in writing, and it must contain that individual's name, the address of the individual, and the problem or action alleged to be discriminatory with a remedy or relief that they're seeking out. That Section 504 coordinator should conduct an investigation of that complaint. It can be informal, but it should be thorough. Just to ensure that all interested persons have an opportunity to submit evidence relevant to that complaint. And then lastly on this slide, Section 504 coordinators must maintain the files and records relating to the grievances they received. The 504 coordinator will issue a written decision on that grievance no later than 120 days of its filing. The person who has filed that grievance may appeal that decision that the 504 coordinator made within 15 days of receiving that decision. And the agency shall issue a written decision in response to that appeal no later than 30 days after its filing, if that does arise. We are also having folks maintain a grievance log. And so with this log, it must include information such as the name of each participant, the date or of the meetings, if there are more than one, the nature of and specific reasons for the proposed disposition of that complaint, the procedures by which a complainant may obtain a grievance hearing if they are not satisfied with the outcome of that informal decision or discussion, excuse me. I'm going to pass it back to Teresa discussing housing development requirements.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. So now we're going to talk more specifically about what we're requiring of our housing developments going forward. So we've got some updated physical accessibility requirements. So through the voluntary compliance agreement, we have these basically doubling the Section 504 regulations for projects that are starting construction after July 2nd, 2025. For federally funded new construction projects with 5 or more units getting funding through DOH, we're requiring a minimum of 10% of your units accessible for folks with mobility disabilities, plus an additional 4% accessible for folks with hearing or vision disabilities. Again, that's an addition. So if you've got a 100-unit building, you've got 10 units that are mobility accessible, an additional 4 that are sensory disabilities. So a total of 14 units that have some sort of accessibility components to it. Those units obviously need to be on an accessible route so that people can access them. We often get questions about percentages. So if you've got, I don't know, a 62-unit building and you want to make 6 of them accessible for folks with mobility disabilities, I can't do the math off the top of my head, but that's something like 9.6 or 7%. That's not 10%. So you always have to go at least 10% or more. So you'd have to do an additional unit to reach the minimum of 10% of the units accessible for folks with mobility disabilities. For rehab, so if it's substantial rehab, that means that's defined in Section 504 as there's 15 or more units and you're spending 75% or more of the replacement cost on the rehab, then that follows the new construction rules. If you're doing less than that, then you don't have to follow those same new construction rules, but that it is required that anything that you are updating anyways, just go ahead and make 10% of that accessible, 4% accessible for sensory disabilities. And if you have any unit that the entire unit is being remodeled anyways, maybe you're not remodeling every unit, but you have this one unit that you're remodeling everything. And that's defined as you're redoing the kitchen cabinets, redoing all the bathroom tub, plumbing accessories, and you're redoing the door jambs already, then just make that unit accessible because you're already, doing all that work. And so it's not too much of a hassle to make it accessible at that point. Again, this is all to the maximum extent feasible. So if you just got a layout that you can't possibly extend the door jamb because of load-bearing walls or whatever it may be, it's to the maximum extent feasible. So just work with your architect to make sure that you're doing what you can to make those units accessible. So as far as specific standards that we'll be using, we can use either Uniform Federal Accessibility Standards, sometimes we call it UFAS. HUD also allows for an alternative accessibility standard, which is based on 2010 ADA standards and has 11 HUD exceptions. And there's a notice from HUD that details those exceptions to the 2010 ADA standards. Or you're allowed to use a standard that is equivalent or stricter than UFAS. So making sure that you work with your architect to meet all of those requirements. Those units should be dispersed throughout the building, not all concentrated in one corner of the building. And another question that we get often is about type A and type B units, because people know those terms, but that's really a separate question from the 504 because it's type A and type B are a different set of codes altogether. So UFAS, or the Alternative Accessibility Standard, are what we're using for Section 504. So again, another reason to just work with your architect to make sure you are meeting the most restrictive standards from all your various funding sources. And I did want to point out that CHAFA just recently, like a couple days ago, published this affordable multifamily accessibility comparison report. I think it's about 20 pages long, and it goes into some details of what the differences are between the accessibility requirements, but it's still like written in layperson terms, so it's easy to understand, and I recommend taking a look at that. So the same standards are for that I showed on the previous slide are the same standards you'll use for sensory accessibility, and you'll pay particular attention to your visual alarms and auxiliary alarms, protections against protruding objects, making sure you have consumer information, range, cooktock, and oven controls, and if there's a public telephone, there's some rules about telephone accessibility. I'm not an architect, so how are we at DOH going to verify compliance? And the answer is we're going to hire a consultant to help out with this because we are not architects. And so we are working on hiring a consultant, and they'll be helping out by reviewing construction plans at application for funds. And they'll also be performing at least one on-site visit after construction is done. Now, as much as possible, we'll be working with them to either coordinate and go at the same time as your ordinary monitoring visit from your AM, or maybe they'll be able to come early while the units are still vacant, just to reduce burden on you. But yeah, so the consultant will be the one that's helping us out with those compliance issues and documenting any corrective actions that are needed. So that's as it relates to the physical accessibility requirements. Again, that's July 2nd, 2025 going forward. And we also have some policy and procedure requirements. And this does apply to all federally funded projects through DOH. So your home, your HDF, your CDBG, all housing developments that are within their period of affordability. And so I'm going to transition now to our DOH Forms and Guidance website. Bear with me while I transition over. So I wanted to show you this because we have a bunch of new resources available on this website. This is what it looks like. You're going to go to the section 504/reasonable accommodation tab. And I'll just go through some of these. So one thing that we'll be looking for going forward on all of our projects, and again, all our projects in the period of affordability, is this verification of compliance. So you'll fill out this, this page right here, and it certifies that you have reviewed this document, implemented these policies, staff have been trained, and you've published the Section 504 notice. You'll see that there's a list of forms down here. If you have any questions about what is, the effective communication policy, it's listed down below. And we will be asking for everybody to be signing this and returning it to us here in the near future. I do want to mention one thing is that don't request edit access. So this is a template that is visible to everybody. If you want to use it, go to File, Download, and that's what we'll be asking you to do to fill it out. Perhaps one day we will update the website so it automatically downloads. It didn't get into this website update, so that's what we'll ask you to do for now. So all of these forms are available under this section with one exception. The Affirmative Fair Housing Marketing Plan is available here under Lease Up and Monitoring. You guys are very familiar with this, I'm sure. We're just asking that all housing developments include outreach to folks with or disability rights advocacy groups, or reaching out to folks with disabilities through their affirmative marketing plan. So going back to the Section 504, we still have the Section 504 self-evaluation. Jennifer did a really great training on that a few months ago, and I recommend you check that out. So I won't go into that today. So here are all the remainder of those policies that are listed on that form. The reasonable accommodation policy, as Jennifer mentioned, talks about what is the process for somebody requesting a reasonable accommodation? What's the time frame? What's the appeal process where they disagree with the decision? And I want to point out, so this is a template policy that you are welcome to use. If you hopefully you already have a reasonable accommodation policy, just check it against this. The first thing on all of these templates is the instructions, and that is like literally word for word what we will be looking for when we review your reasonable accommodation policy, right? So this is your cheat sheet. Your instructions are your cheat sheet. Compare your current reasonable accommodation policy to the cheat sheet. If you're like, oh, our reasonable accommodation policy really needs a facelift, you're welcome to use this template. As you can see, it goes along and starts through the whole template. So feel free to use this, put it on your letterhead, tweak it however you like. The other thing, a couple other things. Okay. One thing that I know that some folks have been confused about in the past, including myself, the Fair Housing Act distinguishes between reasonable accommodations and reasonable modifications. So, but the Section 504 groups both of those together under reasonable accommodation. So when in this template, when we're talking about reasonable accommodation policy, we're talking about both reasonable accommodations and reasonable modifications. The other thing I want to say is that a lot of these templates were on our website already. I did a bunch of work to, just polish them up, make sure they're good to go. But I'm a human. If I made a typo and you open it up and you're like, oh my gosh, there's a glaring error in this, let us know so that we can fix it going forward. So in addition to the policy, we have a number of forms that you're welcome to use or tweak for your own purposes. Obviously, somebody submitting a reasonable accommodation, they're not required to use this particular form. They're not required to submit it in writing at all, although you may want to document in writing, but having the form available for them, if that's, is something you should have. You should have a set of forms available, and you're welcome to use this template, put it on your letterhead, tweak it so that it works for your team. So as you can see, we have a bunch of different forms here: request forms, verification forms, decision form, appeal form if somebody disagrees with the decision, a verification of a continued need, and an implementation plan to document, okay, we've approved this reasonable accommodation. Here's how we're going to implement this going forward. We also have a reasonable accommodation log, and this has been up on our website for a while, but just to remind you all, on the second page here, we've got, request number, applicant or resident name, address, date, et cetera, and it talks about, in the second row here, it talks about why you might request this information and what sort of information to put in. And then we've got some examples down below of what that might look like in real life. And then our second tab here, or third tab here, is just going to be a blank version of that for you to tweak and use however works for your team. Next, I'm going to look at the assistance animal policy. So again, the assistance animal policy, we're going to be looking for a policy that addresses both service animals and emotional support animals, any sort of assistance animals, and no weight or breed restrictions, no deposits or fees, and no vaccination or licensing information. So if you're operating a property that has a no pet rule, obviously the reasonable accommodation is to waive that no pet rule. If you've got a building that allows for pets but has, let's say, breed restrictions, then the reasonable accommodation would be to waive that breed restriction for your assistance animals. Next is the effective communication policy. And again, Jennifer touched on this, but this is going to address how are you going to make sure that folks with communication-related disabilities, that you can still interact with them, communicate with them so that they get the information they need. Not requiring that they provide the auxiliary aid, but providing the assistance, the housing development providing the assistance. And again, if you're not sure what sort of auxiliary aid the person might need, you can always just ask them. They will know. So we do need a written effective communication policy. Next is the grievance policy, again, that Jennifer touched on. This relates to, this is for organizations that have 15 or more employees. And if the employee has a concern or complaint about, if they think they've been discriminated against based on the disability, this is the policy of how they would submit that complaint and how that would be resolved, et cetera, timing for all of that stuff. We do also have a grievance log, so we do require that you keep a log of any grievances that are submitted. And that's basically the same as the reasonable accommodation log. Section 504, non-discrimination notice. This is pretty simple. It's just a short notice that we will be looking for on your website, on your application materials, on promotional materials, just making sure that when a member of the public interacts with you as an organization, they know that the organization doesn't discriminate, which of course it doesn't fully, and that if they have any concerns about discrimination or anything related to that or needed some sort of reasonable accommodation, they know who to contact and how to contact that person. And then the last policy I want to talk about today is the transfer policy and lease addendum. So we talked about the physical accessibility requirements. So you have this building that has all these accessible units. How do we make sure that those units are being occupied by folks who can benefit from those accessible features? So there's a specific list, specific order in which you should be leasing up those units with accessible features. If you go through your current residents, your wait list, et cetera, and you can't find anybody who qualifies, who needs those accessible features, the next thing you're going to look at is, what does my marketing look like? Have I reached out to groups that might be able to pair me up with somebody who needs those accessible features? And then finally, if you do all your marketing and you still can't find somebody who needs the accessible features, we don't want that unit to go empty. So we are allowed to lease it up to a household that does not need the accessible features. However, that household must sign a lease addendum. We've got a template lease addendum down here. It just acknowledges that this household is occupying a housing unit with accessible features, even though they don't require those accessible features. And if a household comes along who does need those accessible features, the household may be displaced to a comparable unit in the same housing development. So next time a unit comes available and it's a non-accessible unit, but a household that needs accessible features applies to occupy that unit, then you would transfer the person from the household from the accessible unit to the non-accessible unit and move the household that needs the accessibility features into the accessible unit. So I'm going to transition back to my slideshow. One moment, please. Here we go. So again, that's all available on our website. Download it, use it, and let me know if you see any glaring typos. So how will we verify compliance with this? As I said, we will be collecting that accessibility verification of compliance here from all of our housing development partners in the coming months. Going forward, it will be as part of your annual compliance monitoring. So we're coming out to do the monitoring anyways. We'll just ask for that form as part of the regular admin docs that we ask for. We do want you to provide those policies to applicants and residents at application and recertification so that they know about the policies. And additionally, we will be required to perform an annual in-depth review of all of those policies listed for at least 10 randomly selected housing developments every year. So for most folks, the accessibility verification of compliance will be sufficient, but we will be doing cherry picking some randomly selected in-depth review of those policies. So make sure they're ready to go. And just so you all know, we at DOH are also required to do our annual reporting to HUD. So that's why we're asking for the documents from you, because we have to report to HUD. So it's all moving along. So those accessibility certifications that you sign, those will be passed along to HUD. Also, any documentation of noncompliance and any steps taken as needed to remedy that noncompliance, we are required to report that to HUD. We have a few additional resources for you here, just some training we have available, and the internet's a wonderful place. So if you need more information about any of those things, check it out. And that's about all we have for today. And let's open it up for some questions. And I will stop sharing, I believe, so that I can see.
Thanks, Teresa. Yeah, I just wanted to open it up. If there's any questions, feel free to come off mute, raise your hand, or put them in the chat. And we will also have our presenters be staying on at the end of the call if you want to, or feel more comfortable asking your question, not in front of the larger group. Yes, go ahead. I can't see your name, but if you want to come off mute.
Sorry, it didn't let me. It's Lorenzo with Foothills Regional Housing.
Hi, Lorenzo.
Hi, so I was just double checking. So you said everything that is going to affect was July what of 2025?
So for the physical accessibility requirements, it'll be after July 2nd, 2025.
July 2nd. Okay, thank you.
And then the programmatic policy requirements apply to all of our projects within the period of affordability.
Okay, thank you.
And I think I'll just clarify really quickly that if we have new agreements coming down the pike, excuse me, for new agreements coming down the pike, we have the July 2nd date. So if we have grant or loan agreements executed on July 2nd or construction starting on July 2nd, that's when this will be applicable to those active agreements.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Dana, did you have a question?
I did, thank you. Just kind of getting some clarification on substantial rehab, existing portfolio. We just have projects that have no accessible units because of the way they're designed, right? They're garden level units or whatever. So how does that factor in? Do you get some sort of waiver, exemption? I mean, we're not going to be able to change the entire structure of our existing portfolio to comply with these 10%, regulations, which are easy for new construction, but not easy for existing portfolio and acquisition.
Yeah, so if it's an existing unit or building, the 10% and 4% will only come into play if you're receiving federal funds through DOH on or after July 2nd, 2025. It doesn't mean that you have to go back and rehab stuff that's existing and just in place, right? Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, I guess, just larger philosophically, right, as we're trying to keep units affordable, NOAA units, right? So many of them are not going to meet these credentials. And so now you're removing an entire stream of funding that could be used to take these down. So good to know.
And the other thing is if you're like for an acquisition only project or for a rehab where you're spending less than 75% of the replacement cost on rehab, like if it's just a minor rehab, then those 10% and 4% requirements don't apply.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
But, yeah.
All
I would
right.
I would also clarify that if it's a project that's in its period of affordability, you're not required to retroactively make those changes to accessible units. However, you would treat those with reasonable accommodation. So if a need came up, you would handle that as you traditionally would via reasonable accommodation.
So
Thank
can I
you.
jump in here? I actually didn't hear the answer to the part that she was asking at the beginning. So she was asking about our garden level. So like at Parkview Village, we have garden level units there. There is absolutely no way for us to make those wheelchair accessible. Is there an exemption for us to submit for that? Because that without redoing the entire layout of the property, we would not be able to make those wheelchair accessible. So is there an exemption that we would apply for, or how does that work?
I would like to take that question offline. I think it's very specific to that project. I would like to, Lorenzo, if we could connect after this meeting.
Absolutely. Dana, I would include you on that as well.
Yeah, but I think I heard that as long as our federal funding flowed into the project prior to this date, that we just continue operating as is. And then if any money were applied to this project after the date, July, whatever it is, then we would be required to be in compliance. But it's really all hinges on that execution date.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, the normal section 504 would still apply, which is the 5% and 2%. The July 2nd is the implementation of the doubling to 10% and 4%. But yeah, happy to chat more about that specific project.
All right, any other questions? Okay, looks like we don't have any. I'm going to stop the recording.